G'day guys. The holiday season's almost here, and with it usually comes big sales, including things like Black Friday. So today I thought we'll go through a few of our budget handhelds and see which ones are worth recommending as either gifts for friends and family or even for yourself. Starting off with the cheapest one that's worth buying, the GB300. You can get these in both red and black, but they do both run the same. You can generally pick these up for around $20 Australian, occasionally even cheaper at around $15 or $16 on sale. Out of the box, they're not too bad, but they do get way better if you take the time to install the custom multi-core firmware. The custom multi-core firmware not only adds a whole bunch of extra systems that you can emulate, but the latest version actually adds a bunch of features to the stock emulators. Things like fast forward and rewind. As far as performance goes, lower end systems like NES, Game Boy Color, Master System and Mega Drive all run pretty much perfectly. Super Nintendo is a bit hit or miss, but a lot of the more popular ones are at least playable. Things like Donkey Kong Country 1, 2 and 3, Mega Man X 1, 2 and 3, and Super Mario World 1. Yoshi's Island on the Super Nintendo does actually struggle on this, so that might be a bit of a deal breaker for some. Game Boy Advance is also a bit hit or miss, but the latest multi-core has drastically improved GBA performance. Loads of GBA games are now fully playable, but some are still too slow to be enjoyable. Things like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2. That's pretty much where it caps out for emulation. There's no PS1 or DOSBox emulator for this, which is a bit of a shame. As far as hardware goes, there's no headphone socket and there's no brightness control. So if you're looking for something to play late at night in bed, this can actually hurt your eyes. It's also worth mentioning the SF2000, which is basically the same hardware, only with a horizontal form factor. Performance between these two handhelds are pretty much identical, and apart from the form factor, the main difference is the SF2000 has a much better screen, and it also has a joystick which is hard mapped to the D-pad. So up on the joystick is up on the D-pad, and that is at a hardware level, so you can't remap either of these independently. There's also no headphone socket or brightness control. I wouldn't recommend getting the SF2000 just because it does usually go for around $30 to $35 Australian, and at that price point, there are better alternatives. It's also worth mentioning the screen tearing on the SF2000 is a lot worse than on the GB300. For some that isn't a big deal, but for others it is definitely a deal breaker. Next up we have the original R36S. There are a bunch of slightly different variants of these, ones with larger screens or built-in Wi-Fi, and some even with different gamepad layouts, but we'll be focusing on the original models. These generally go for around $40 Australian, but they can be picked up for around $35 Australian on sale. These are generally going to be the best bang for buck handhelds that you can get, as far as emulation performance, features, and build quality goes. These will handle pretty much everything up to PS1 just about flawlessly, and it can also do some PSP, Dreamcast, and N64 games, which is pretty cool. The original R36S does not have built-in Wi-Fi, but it does have a USB OTG port, so you can connect things like USB mice, keyboards, or wireless adapters. It's worth noting that the R36S is actually heavily cloned, and although they may visually look the same, they do run slightly different operating systems. The one on the left is an original Panel 4 device, the one on the right is a K36 clone. The main difference between the two are what operating systems it can actually run. The non-clone on the left has an Android port, an Armbian port, as well as a bunch of different emulation-focused operating systems, like Newly or Rocknix. Some clones also have half the RAM at only 512 meg, which definitely hinders performance of things like ports. If you were looking at getting an R36S, I will link the R36S Wiki's buyer's guide, which should hopefully help you avoid getting a clone. It's also worth mentioning that these handhelds are quite fragile, and even a drop from a small height will damage the screen permanently. It is just something to keep in mind. If you aren't a fan of the vertical form factor, then you can also get this in a horizontal form factor. This is the R36H. At the time of filming this video, there's no known clones of the R36H, so if you were worried about accidentally buying a clone, this might be a better option. The hardware is identical, only the R36H lacks a function button, which isn't really that big of a deal, since you can just change the hotkey to select. The R36H is usually more expensive than the R36S, sitting around $50 Australian on average, so it's up to you if you want to pay the extra $10 or $15 for a horizontal form factor. Anbernic also make a range of budget handhelds. This here is the Anbernic RG40XXH. Performance-wise, it's basically the same as an R36S, only you do get a much higher build quality, and this one here has RGB lighting around the joysticks. You can change the color of this, and it also has built-in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. These are generally a lot more expensive than the R36S though, and usually go for around $60 to $80 Australian, if not more. Since the performance is pretty much identical to the R36S, I personally wouldn't recommend these lower-end Anbernic devices, even though you do get a lot higher build quality, especially if you're not interested in the upgrades, like the RGB lighting or the built-in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Out of all the handhelds I own, this one has definitely gotten the least amount of playtime. Next up, we have two fairly cheap SP style clamshells. On the right we have the original PowerKitty V90, not the upgraded V90S, and on the left is the original Anbernic RG35XX SP. The Anbernic 35XP on the left has pretty much identical performance to the horizontal RG40XXH we just saw earlier, although obviously in a different form factor. Unfortunately, there have been a number of reports on hinges breaking on pretty much all of these clamshell devices. I don't think I've seen any devices that hasn't had anyone reporting a broken hinge, so that might be worth keeping in mind if you're looking at one of these. The Anbernic RG35XX SP on the left usually goes for around $80 to $100 Australian, which is quite expensive, and the original PowerKitty V90 usually sits at around $40 Australian, so that is quite cheap. As far as performance goes on the PowerKitty V90, it is slightly above the GB300 and SF2000 handhelds. It does lower end systems like NES, Game Boy, Game Boy Color pretty much perfectly, but it does struggle with things like Super Nintendo, Game Boy Advance, and PS1. The V90 does cap out at PS1, and very few games are actually fully playable, but there is also a DOSBox port for it, which also performs pretty poorly. Things like the original Commander Keen work fine, or Duke Nukem 1, but anything higher than that, it just won't play it. Although these SP style clamshells are good in theory, the hinge issues always put me off using mine. The last one we'll be taking a look at today is the Anbernic RG Nano. I was able to get mine for around $40 Australian on sale from AliExpress, but they usually sit around $50 or $60 Australian off sale. This one is absolutely tiny, as you can see. It's not big at all. It does have extremely high build quality. The entire thing is aluminium, which is really nice. It's got a beautiful screen on it, and as far as performance goes, it does up to PS1 pretty well as a few lighter DOS games. I haven't really had any issues with Super Nintendo or Game Boy Advance on this one either. The main drawback is the tiny screen. It is pretty hard to see, and the tiny buttons can give you a hand cramp, only after playing for a few minutes. Most people recommend playing this with one hand, which is really only good for RPGs like Pokemon. I don't think you can actually beat an action game like Mega Man on this using only one hand. It does come with a little keyring you can attach to it out of the box, but since there's no screen protector, if you just had this attached to your set of car keys, it wouldn't take too long for the screen to get fully scratched. I wouldn't recommend this for full-time daily use, but I think it would make a really great gift for someone, especially if you can get it for around $40 Australian. Although not technically a handheld, I thought I would mention these cheap HDMI gaming sticks that you can get from places like AliExpress. They usually go for around $20 Australian and come with one or two PS2 style USB wireless controllers. And while that may seem like a bargain, I would not recommend picking one of these up. There are a ton of slightly different versions of this, all with the same case, but they do all require slightly different firmware. Couple that with the fact that the stock OS is pretty shocking, and even the custom OSs that are available for some of these sticks aren't that great either. You are also limited to 1 gig of user ROM space, so if you wanted to add some PlayStation games, you are sort of limited to just the one at a time. Also, as with most of these devices, the stock SD card is incredibly low quality, and on this device, if the SD card fails, you are going to have to spend way too much time trying to find a compatible OS for it. Overall, it's best to avoid these cheap game sticks. So now we've gone through pretty much all of the retro handhelds that I own. The two best value ones would definitely be the GB300 or the R36S. If you just want something that's really cheap and you can throw into a backpack and you don't care too much if it gets broken, and also you only really want to emulate Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Sega Master System, Mega Drive or Game Gear, the NES, and don't care too much about the higher end systems like N64 or PS1, then this might be the one to get. As mentioned, Super Nintendo and Game Boy Advance can be a bit hit or miss, although a lot of the more popular ones do actually run, at least acceptably. If instead you want something that's going to be able to emulate way more systems, has a much higher build quality, way more features, multiple different OSs like Android or desktop Linux, and you don't mind spending a little bit more money, around $35 or $40 Australian, then I would definitely recommend the R36S. In my opinion, this is still the best value handheld overall, especially with all the cool stuff that it can do. If you're wanting to know a little bit more about all of these handhelds, I have made videos on pretty much all of them, showcasing all the cool stuff that they can do over on my channel. It's also worth mentioning again that no matter what handheld you end up buying, you should also buy a decent high quality SD card to go along with it, since the stock ones that are included are incredibly low quality and will fail at any moment, making your handhelds pretty much useless until you end up getting a fresh SD card anyway. I think that'll do it for today. If you have any questions or comments, let me know down below. Otherwise, thanks for watching.